Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining today's roundtable discussion chat titled The Many Eyes in Artificial Intelligence. My name is Dr. Sally Baxter. I'm an East Asian female with black hair and glasses, and I'm thrilled to be your moderator today. I'm the chief for Ophthalmology, Informatics, and Data Science at the University of California, San Diego. And today we will be discussing opportunities and considerations of artificial intelligence in eye care while taking into consideration the patient experience as well. I think this is a very, very exciting time to be working in AI in eye care. We have had so many advances over the last decade or so, and especially in the last couple of years. And many of you may have heard about AI in the media, around being able to diagnose diseases from images or come up with better ways of predicting disease risk and progression. There's a lot of excitement about being able to combine different sources of data together, whether that's data from clinical records, electronic healthcare records, imaging data, wearable devices, and genomic data. And certainly it affects so many different stakeholders, including health systems, physicians, both ophthalmologists and non-ophthalmologists as we try to coordinate care, and of course our patients. And today's discussion will give us a chance to hear, straight from experts who are working in this space. And I'm so lucky to be able to introduce our panelists for this session. So first we have Dr. Michael Abramoff, and he's the founder and executive chairman of Digital Diagnostics and the Watzke Professor of Ophthalmology at the University of Iowa. Dr. Cecilia Lee, who is the professor of ophthalmology and the Klorfine family endowed chair in the Department of Ophthalmology at the University of Washington. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Benjamin Xu. He is an associate professor of clinical ophthalmology and chief of the glaucoma service, as well as director of the data science and AI core at the University of Southern California Roski Eye Institute. So before we get into the discussion, we have just a few housekeeping items. So today's discussion is going to be recorded and made available at the Prevent Blindness website, and that link will be provided in our chat. Recordings should be added within a week, although it could be sooner. For example, some of the recordings from day one are already available on the website. In addition, speaker and moderator bios are available in the Summit Lounge. And today we will take some questions from the audience, and we'll respond to as many as time allows. You can submit questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We're going to try to get through as many questions as we can during the time today, but in case we run out of time, just so everyone's aware, there will be a speaker chat session at a separate Zoom link afterward, and we'll provide the information about that at the end of today's session in case there are questions that we don't get to during our scheduled time right now. All right, so with all that housekeeping taken care of, thanks so much to our panelists for joining us today, and we'll get started. So first, I'd like each of the panelists to just briefly introduce yourself and the work you're doing in AI, along with sharing why you became interested in this area, and just a reminder to use your audio self-description in your introduction. So maybe we can start with Dr. Cecilia Lee.
Thank you, Dr. Baxter. Hi, I'm Dr. Cecilia Lee. I'm an Asian woman in the 40s, wearing black glasses. I have black hair, and I'm wearing a navy dress. Okay, so I started this area. Well, so my background is in clinical epidemiology. I'm a medical retina specialist, and our research endeavor really started in big data using electronic health records. And at that time, deep learning, artificial intelligence wasn't like such a popular term by then. But when we started using not only just the electronic health records in terms of diagnosis, procedure codes, but then when we started getting more data in terms of clinical input, and then honestly, with the retinal imaging, when we try to kind of interpret the retinal imaging, we had a lot of limitations until we really integrated artificial intelligence or machine learning and deep learning. These are all kind of parts of the parts of artificial intelligence um, techniques that we try to use to interpret and integrate all the retinal imaging. So that's kind of how the research started in this area. And I'm very excited because of so much potential, and hopefully I will kind of talk into about this in a little bit. And our my lab is in computational ophthalmology that focuses on data science, big data, and machine learning approaches. And we really try to leverage the fact that the eyes are really the part of the brain, and then eyes are really a unique area, unique organ where we can take a look and then really get amazing information of the rest of the body. So we are trying to really use the retinal imaging and then eye-related data combined with all the other systemic, very next generation data to understand better our health, disease development, and disease progression.
Wonderful. It's like the eyes are the windows to the soul. And I know, Dr. Lee, you've been a pioneer in looking at how the eyes are the window to our brains and the rest of our bodies. So thanks so much for joining us. Dr. Xu, can you introduce yourself as well?
Sure, of course. Thank you. I just want to say it's a pleasure to be here with everyone today. I am a glaucoma specialist, but also a biomedical engineer by training. I am in my 40s. I am Asian, East Asian. I have short hair, short black hair, and I'm currently wearing a blue blazer. It's wonderful to be here. And when I started my career, my primary focus was on adapting existing or emerging technologies to address needs in glaucoma care. We started by focusing on a condition called angle closure glaucoma, which is a particularly blinding form of glaucoma, to try to modernize the way that we detect patients who are at risk for this sight-threatening condition. And so in order to do that, we married optical coherence tomography, which is a standard imaging technique in ophthalmology, with artificial intelligence in order to make this technology more accessible to clinicians. This had been a major barrier to adoption of OCT imaging for the care of patients with angle closure. And so far, it has proven to be superior to the current method of evaluation, which is something called gonioscopy, for detecting at-risk patients. More recently, I've applied some of the expertise I gained in the AI domain in order to help lead an effort here in Los Angeles called the AI and Teleophthalmology in Los Angeles, or ATLAS initiative. And our goal here is to automate aspects of teleophthalmology care using AI in order to improve clinical workflows, but also to improve patient access, the reproducibility, and the quality of care for the generally underserved safety net population of Los Angeles County Department of Health Services. So that's currently where we are with AI, and it is an exciting time to be working in this domain. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of AI implementation, and it's great that we can have this discussion today with the participation of patients as well.
Wonderful, thank you. And I know a lot of your work has been very community-based with a lot of public health relevance. So I'm sure it'll be of interest to our audience members today. And last but not least, Dr. Abramoff, also no stranger to teleophthalmology and to screening, and certainly being an innovator and pioneer in this space. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work?
Yeah, thanks so much, and very excited to be here. I'm so sorry there's some background noise because I'm currently at an airport. And ultimately I will have to get up and catch my flight. I look like an older Jewish male. I have white hair and a white mustache and a weird beard, and I'm wearing a hat. No glasses today. And like you said, I'm a retina specialist, trained as a retinal surgeon at the University of Iowa in the Midwest. I'm also a computer engineer and have been working in what is now called artificial intelligence for almost 30 years. And my focus has been on expanding access to about 70 or 80% of people who do not get access to the care they need: specialty care, eye care, diabetic eye exams, glaucoma exams, and using AI to do that. And there's a specific form of AI that proposed, which is autonomous AI, which is where it's fully a computer making medical diagnoses or treatment decisions, not so much supervised by a physician. And we have been very successful with that. It's fastest growing AI, medical AI in the world, as a recent publication, New England Journal of Medicine showed, in terms of patient utilization, which is key to all of this, right? If patients do not have access to it, why do all of this? You may think, well, autonomous AI sounds a little bit scary, and that is true. And there's a lot of concerns when you bring it up. And so there was a lot of work had to be done to create essentially everyone that has to do with healthcare to be in favor of this. That includes patient organization. I'm very excited to talk to people like you because their support, your support is critical. Without you, it will not happen. But also physicians, specialists, payers, meaning Medicare, private payers, ethicists, all of need to be on board before you can even have things like regulation or reimbursement. So we were successful in doing all of that. I'm very proud to say since 2018, the FDA approved this autonomous AI for use. It's almost at 1,000 sites now, which is very exciting. So many people are having now access where they never had access before. Reimbursement was created. I'm very proud of that, including great news from yesterday. But most importantly, we are now starting to see the results of randomized controlled trials, which is sort of the highest standard in clinical evidence that indeed this technology does what we hoped it would do, which is improve health equity, meaning remove health disparities in access to care, as well as increase physician productivity and even physician satisfaction with their work, as well as cost saving. So it's a very exciting time because we're starting to prove that all of this work that we are all, so motivated for is worth it.
Wonderful. Yeah. Thank you for sharing. Well, for all of you for the introductions. And I think Dr. Abramoff, you've really launched us into our first, discussion topic, which is around using AI for screening. And of course, you just described, many key successes in AI screening for diabetic retinopathy, including autonomous AI and sort of all these different things that you've really led to kind of make that workflow implementation possible. As a follow-up to that, I'd like to maybe ask Dr. Xu to talk about what some of the challenges might be for screening for glaucoma, compared to diabetic retinopathy and the successes there. What can we learn from that? What additional challenges might there be for glaucoma screening programs? And after that, perhaps Dr. Lee, you could talk about how you envision AI working on screening programs for systemic disease. So why don't we start with Dr. Xu on screening in glaucoma and how you see AI playing a role there?
Sure. The importance of glaucoma screening can't be understated. We know that the majority of glaucoma worldwide, over 50% of it, is still undetected. And when the disease is detected later on in its course, it becomes harder to control with medications and surgeries, and certainly the risk of surgery also increases. So early detection is really key. The disease is irreversible. And currently we are using AI to identify patients who are at risk for glaucoma. But this is where we run into one of the challenges of glaucoma compared to something like diabetic retinopathy, which is that there aren't good standardized definitions for the disease, especially when it's milder in its course and it hasn't caused detectable vision loss yet. And so this has been a formidable barrier to adoption of AI in glaucoma. In addition, the United States Preventive Services Task Force has questioned the utility of generalized glaucoma screening in the population due to unclear evidence that early detection of mild glaucoma or high-risk glaucoma suspects actually improves clinical outcomes. And so it's this lack of evidence in conjunction with the lack of clear consensus definitions of disease that make it quite difficult to screen for patients. However, it doesn't undermine the importance of identifying patients who've already lost vision, patients with more moderate to severe disease, who should be detected and should receive sight-saving treatments while they are still able to be treated in a safe manner. And so I think AI is very important in this regard because it provides a certain standardization or reproducibility of detection that becomes very hard when you have optometrists or ophthalmology graders who look at photographs or images to say this patient has glaucoma. It adds a lot of variability to a diagnosis that already lacks a consensus definition. And so we hope that AI can improve the reproducibility of the grading of these images so that patients can have more fair and equitable access to care, right? We know that a well-trained AI algorithm performs as well, if not better, than a trained expert. And imagine if we could deliver that kind of high quality diagnostic care to all patients. Wouldn't that be wonderful? And so that really is the objective. And the focus of our current program in Los Angeles is to identify those patients who have already lost vision using these very fair and reproducible tools.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that perspective, and a lot of challenges in glaucoma. That I think it's great that we have people like you working on that. And so yeah, just transitioning. I guess we've been talking about these diseases where we can screen for eye diseases and follow up with an eye care specialist for treatment. Maybe kind of the converse is if you're using the eyes to screen for systemic disease. Dr. Lee, can you talk about how you envision that happening and what challenges or issues there might be in that kind of a screening workflow where it's maybe referral to other medical services if you use the eye to detect cardiovascular disease or neurological disease? I know you've had a lot of research in this area, so we'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Thank you. So there are a lot of potential, and then really that's kind of what excites me to be in this field right now. So if you think about the eyeballs themselves, they're really easy to look. So I kind of really find myself really lucky to be an ophthalmologist because we could dilate, sometimes not even dilate, right? And then directly look at the retina and look at the retinal vessels and whether there are any abnormalities like tiny little bleeding, plaques, exudates, and things like that, that makes me understand better about their systemic health at that point. And there are, the ability, and then that concept of being able to just directly look at the retina, at the tissue itself, and then gaining the information for the rest of the body has been a really attractive concept. And then it's not new, right? So many research has been happening. So an example would be the use of fundus photograph, which is take a photo of the back of the retina and looking at the coronary artery calcium, which is it's called CAC score. So those are the score that kind of tells you how much calcium deposit you have in the coronary arteries, which are the main arteries that go from the heart to the brain, essentially, and then goes to the eye as well. And traditionally, you had to get a CT scan, which is much more expensive, more invasive because you get a lot of radiation. But imagine if you can just take a retina photo, and then that kind of really predicts, in a matter of less than a minute, it can tell you whether you have a lot of calcium built up on those arteries, which can be a risk factor for having a stroke, both in the eyes and then also in the brain. So a lot of strong relationship between eye status and then also the cardiovascular health. One disease that I'm particularly interested in, particularly, is the Alzheimer's disease or neurodegenerative diseases. And then we've done a lot of work on looking at the cognitive impairment, dementia, and Alzheimer's disease development, because we found a lot of strong relationship between just the fact that you have eye diseases such as age-related macular degeneration, diabetic retinopathy, or early phases of glaucoma, your risk of developing Alzheimer's disease in the future goes up by 50–60%, which is remarkable because that's kind of similar to you having a genetic risk factor called ApoE4 level. And then, so if we are just using those kind of really rudimentary eye disease health variables, such as whether you have the disease or not. And I can still predict that somebody has a really strong risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. Imagine if we use the artificial intelligence to deeply characterize even better than just whether you have disease or not. If I can just say that, your retina has XYZ, this is the, characteristics of your retina, how much more can I predict in terms of your risk of developing neurodegenerative diseases or dementia? So those are kind of the foundational thoughts that we have. But there are challenges. So a lot of artificial intelligence, let me back up. So the Achilles heel of artificial intelligence research is that we need large data sets to train, and then we need a good data set to train with that is very representative of the study of the population. So we don't want a data set that is just from a small center or just based on white population. We want a very large data set that's representative of all the general population. And also, ideally, we would want a longitudinal data that we can learn. So it's not just about one-time snap point where we would call the cross-sectional study design, because the unfortunate part of the cross-sectional study is that we don't know at what point this abnormalities occurred in relationship to when you may have developed this disease. For example, I'm not really sure whether if my training data set is just based on one time point, whether somebody has this abnormality and somebody has this disease such as Alzheimer's disease, I am not able to find out whether this abnormality in particular of the retina occurred before they develop Alzheimer's disease or not. So there are just really this complex relationship. And then unfortunately, we depend on the type of data set that we have available. So there's a lot more research that needs to happen, which is what makes me excited to be part of this study.
Yeah, wonderful. I mean, I think for neurodegenerative diseases, one of the big challenges has been the lack of early biomarkers in the disease course, and that's something I know that your work has been trying to use the eye imaging potentially as a surrogate or as an early biomarker. I just want to pivot a little bit. I know we have some questions from the audience, as well as some of our pre-planned questions that are around implementation. Right. So how do we get these AI models from a research environment to real world settings? And I'd like to ask Dr. Abramoff, who's had a lot of experience with this, to maybe talk about two things. One is, reimbursement and how your experience was that in getting reimbursement for use of AI algorithms. And the second would be around FDA approvals, right? So we have a couple of questions in the Q&A about how are approval paradigms created in FDA around AI, and maybe a bit about post-market surveillance. How do you ensure that the models are still working how you expect them to? I know you've had a lot of experience through your work with digital diagnostics through that. So maybe you could talk about your experiences there for us.
Yeah, sure. And, I'm condensing into maybe a few minutes what would take normally hours to explain. So just, bear with me as I go through it quickly. But I think it starts with, sorry about the background noise. This is Michael Abramoff here. It starts with ethics. That may surprise some, but AI ethics is really a somewhat new field. But if you talk about a technology that has the potential at very large scale, meaning hundreds of millions of patients, to either make their outcomes better, but potentially harm health equity rather than make them better, be safe versus unsafe. Even the liability I saw in the questions, who's liable when an autonomous AI, meaning making the decision by itself, makes an error, and it will happen. It's not perfect. It's better than any specialist, including me, but it's not perfect. So it starts with ethics, because there that allows you, and we did a lot of work on this, on measuring how you meet different ethical principles. And that allows you to decide, well, I want my AI to emphasize patient outcome, or I want to emphasize both patient outcome and health equity, or autonomy of the patient. There's a lot of debate you can have about that. We're not going to do that now. But what I want to emphasize is that this ethical framework that we created has led to regulation based in ethics and also even reimbursement based in ethics. So you might wonder, what is reimbursement to do with ethics? Well, if people are uncomfortable with the ethics around AI and how it's being implemented and developed and proven to be safe or not, and all the other things I mentioned, they will not support it. And support from patient organizations, I repeat myself, physicians, professional societies like the AMA, ethicists, regulators, payers is crucial, because if one of them says we don't want this, it doesn't happen. Innovation in healthcare is difficult enough, and if you have people who are not comfortable with the way it's going, it will not happen. It will be very slow. So you need to have the evidence from ethics, from clinical evidence, from randomized controlled trials, that indeed it does what you hope it does, that it's developed in a way where bias is mitigated, right? Racial bias, ethnical bias, which all have been shown to exist in some AIs and actually have harmed patients. So you need to avoid it. And how do you avoid it? And where do you start? So a lot had to be developed to ensure all of that. And that ultimately led to two things, since you asked about reimbursement. Well, you can base reimbursement on anything, right? You can say, well, we should pay the same to an AI company that is already paid to doctors, but now you're not reducing healthcare expenses, which is one important goal of at least me and my company, or you're not doing anything about health equity. And what we said is, let's base the reimbursement on that 100% of patients who need this can get access. If we can pay for that, let's set a reimbursement to that. And that essentially came down to somewhere around $55, which is ultimately what we ended up with reimbursement. So there is a existing reimbursement for a few years now, actually very strongly confirmed, and actually increased a little bit yesterday when the proposed rules from CMS came out. It's very wonky what I'm saying now, but it's really, really important, because if you want to bring these AIs that we're all so excited about and have a lot of proof for, if you want to bring these to health systems and to doctors using them and to patients getting access, a big question is always going to be, can I get reimbursed for this? How do I get reimbursed for this? So it's crucial for the sustainability of all of this AI that we get this right, and we did. But it was based in ethics, and same for work, and we continue to work very closely with FDA on AI regulation. What do you compare an AI to know it's safe or not, right? You could say, well, we'll compare it to a doctor. Well, let me tell you, I'm a doctor. If I compare myself to my colleagues, I will differ in about 30%, 20% of cases. So if you compare an AI to a doctor and they disagree, do you know that the doctor is right or the doctor is wrong and the AI is right? So it's hard. And that's why, for example, many AIs are now validated against clinical outcome or prognostic standard for clinical outcome. That's just one example of how you can think about, how do we prove it's safe? How do we prove that health equity is improved? Well, you can compare how many patients get access without AI and with AI with the randomized controlled trial. And so that's for regulation, that's for reimbursement. Ultimately, it all starts with getting the ethics right from the start, not after the fact when we say, oh my God, what did we do here? Now patients are being harmed. Then it's too late, and maybe shut down, and all these advantages that we all see will not get realized for our patients.
Thank
Since
you so much.
It's all up for a little bit long, sorry about that.
No, thank you so much. I mean, you brought up so many interesting points, and maybe we can expand upon considerations of bias. And Dr. Lee, I know that you're leading an effort and you mentioned challenges in having the right data sets for training AI models earlier, more around the context of, timing of the outcome development around Alzheimer's. But I thought maybe you could talk about your work with the NIH Bridge to AI initiative about creating diverse data sets, which I believe in part is aimed at addressing this issue of bias. So if you'd like to talk about that, that'd be great.
Thank you. So one of the, like Dr. Baxter mentioned, that's, training AI algorithm that could be generalizable, or it could be fair, or it could be adequately performing well in the targeted population. So let's say that I have like I'm from Atlanta, and then I have I used to have patient population that was like primarily Blacks and African Americans. And if I wanted to an algorithm that could predict that could perform well, I need a training data set that was highly representative of those populations. Um, and let's say that you might have heard of data research going on from UK Biobank, which is a registry or uh, data collection study that started in 2006, over 500,000 people, and they got tons of study, tests such as blood tests, CT, and all the different types of research, and it has generated thousands of, I would say hundreds to thousands of AI studies. And then some of them are published and then have resulted in major publications of major research findings. But they are primarily done in people who are healthy enough, who are willing to, volunteer for hours of testing, right? So when we train AI algorithm just based on that population, the algorithm will perform really well only when we are seeing healthy patients. So that's what really allowed us to kind of go after this Bridge to AI program. So actually, it's the NIH who recognized the power or the potential of AI usage in healthcare research, but they have recognized the limited data set availability that could be used for future AI algorithms. So that was the reason why Bridge to AI program was, and then our program was lucky to be part of one of the 4 programs funded in the States. And Dr. Baxter's is also part of it. So our study is the on study of type 2 diabetes or salutogenesis. So I've actually have never heard of the term salutogenesis. So it's actually the opposite of pathogenesis. So if you're thinking of us always studying why do you get sick? Why do you get that type 2 diabetes? Then it's the reverse of the pathogenesis, is the how do you actually convert yourself into back to health? So if you develop type 2 diabetes, is there any way you could get healthier? You could get less, diabetes, and, even get quote unquote cured. So to enable that type of study, we are collecting multimodal data, and that's ranging from, obviously vitals, demographics, but EKG, a lot of blood work. We are even saving blood specimens for future usage. And then we're getting a lot of retinal imaging. We're getting fitness tracking, wearables, continuous glucose monitoring, which is, the device that we give out to our participants, and then we get glucose monitoring, blood sugar monitoring throughout the day and night. And then we are also even giving the environmental sensor, where we're getting 22 different types of environmental data every 15 seconds at your home. And then so imagine lots of data being collected from our study population. And as Dr. Baxter mentioned, we wanted to make this balance. The balance is the key, meaning that we want the sample size. So it's only 4,000, but we are balancing into 1,000 people who are healthy, like normal, no diabetes, 1,000 people who are diet controlled or pre-diabetes, and 1,000 people who are medication dependent, and then 1,000 people who are insulin dependent for type 2 diabetes. So that's the balance in terms of diabetes status, but we are also balancing 1-in-1 into men and women, and then we're also balancing into 1,000 Asian, 1,000 Hispanic, 1,000 Blacks, and 1,000 white, so that we could kind of balance the major racial and ethnic categories of the United States population. So lots of work is being done, and I'm happy to say that from our pilot data, which is only about 204 participants data, we have generated millions of environmental sensor data, millions of blood sugar data, and hundreds of thousands of retinal imaging, and which would result in millions and millions of data variables. So it's very exciting to see.
Wonderful.
So we are yes.
As a big effort with data collection across the country. And I think just along this same lines of diversity, maybe I can ask Dr. Shu to add in as well. I think we're still on this theme of bias, but it also, talking about, I think we have an audience question too about generalizability and how do you make sure that these AI algorithms apply to your local population. I know you've done a lot of work in that realm with your Atlas work around, looking at Los Angeles populations. Perhaps you can share your thoughts.
Sure. This is Ben Shu. First of all, I'd like to commend Drs. Abramoff and Lee because the scope of their work is truly impressive. To be able to have an algorithm that generalizes over an entire nation, if not world of people, or to be able to sample people in such a robust fashion is terrific. We kind of work on the other end, which is that we already have the data collected on our local population. So being here in Los Angeles, even though it's very diverse, we do have a large Latino or Hispanic population here, and they comprise about 70% of the Los Angeles County Department of Health Services utilization of eye care services, including the teleophthalmology program. So when we have our data, it is already heavily imbalanced. And so the way that we assess it for fairness and bias is that we develop an AI algorithm, say to detect patients who might be at risk for glaucoma, and we'll stratify the analysis. What that means is we'll divide the population into different racial groups or by gender, and we'll assess the performance of the algorithm to see, does it perform equally across all of these different groups? And this is where we run into something interesting on a local level, which is that we find that our algorithm for detecting patients who might be at risk for glaucoma actually isn't fair in its performance. It performs worst in Latinos. And this is interesting because typically when we train these AI algorithms, they tend to perform the best in the population that you have the most data in. And so we're saying, is this really an issue of bias? Is this an unfair algorithm? And so what we did is we actually had to do a deeper dive into the fundus photographs themselves. And the way that we typically identify if patients are at risk for glaucoma is that they have something called cupping, which is if you look at the optic nerve, it typically looks like a donut with a very small hole in the center. But cupping is when this hole in the center is enlarged. And so when we looked at cupping, what we found is that certain races, when they had cupping, it was much more obvious. They had much more severe cupping. And then other populations, they had much less cupping overall. And so what we found is that Latinos, their average cupping was in that gray area where patients could go kind of either way in terms of being referable glaucoma or not. And this is actually what led to this imbalance in the performance. And so I think these types of studies are very important because these imbalances don't always represent inequity or bias of the algorithm. Disease comes in many shapes and forms. And so in some ways, by trying to understand how the AI algorithms work, we can further our understanding of how disease presents differently in different populations. I know, Dr. Baxter, you'd also asked about kind of the localized implementation of AI. Glaucoma is challenging in that way, which is that unlike diabetic retinopathy, and I might be speaking out of ignorance here, but you can typically diagnose diabetic retinopathy just out of using a simple fundus photograph. But in glaucoma, we have a multimodal assessment where we will look at factors such as age, intraocular pressure, and then we have many different machines which we draw data from in order to make this formal diagnosis of glaucoma. And so in glaucoma, one issue is just having this type of computing platform or the data infrastructure in order to combine all of this data, right? And so the diagnosis of disease and the implementation of AI, I think, varies widely by the disease and also the diagnostic process as well. And so that's something that we are working on in the field of glaucoma, which is how do we get data from electronic medical records and from different imaging devices or visual field devices all into the same place so that these AI algorithms can interpret all of this data. And so fortunately here in Los Angeles, we work closely with the Department of Health Services, and we have approval to develop these algorithms. And once we have compelling evidence that the algorithms are performing better than the current standard, at least on a diagnostic level, then we have to go ahead to implement them. So we don't need FDA approval because we're not selling it as a commercial product, but we need buy-in, certainly from the healthcare system, but eventually we'll also need buy-in from the patients themselves, right? And so it is a very exciting time, but there are still a lot of unanswered questions about how best to develop these algorithms and then to implement them as well.
Thanks so much for that. And that's a great segue about patient buy-in. I'll wait to talk about our next set of questions about patient-centered approaches. I see Dr. Lee has her hand up. So Dr. Lee, go ahead, please, if you have something to add here. Go ahead.
Thank you. So I was thinking that even though there is a lot of excitement about trying to use AI to find new biomarkers and the new understanding of disease mechanism, but there is a lot of discrepancy, a lot of room for implementation, kind of really understanding how do we actually translate that, what is exciting in the research side? How do you translate that into clinical practice? Because there's a lot of, yes, I think there's a lot of gap. And then so really, work that Dr. Xu is doing, and then also, Dr. Abramoff is the first person really who figured out how to really make this work in the clinical system. But in terms of all the other algorithms, there's a lot of work that needs to be done.
Yes, Dr. Abramoff, please go ahead.
Yeah, I second what Dr. Lee is saying, but I wanted to add a little bit on top of that. That part of it is, and we worked on this with FDA a lot. I mean, how can you mitigate bias when developing AIs? And it starts even with the concept. And I would want to give this example because I think it's relevant. When you move from this concept of an AI that does things to where it is actually being used on patients in a clinic with limited manpower and with limited resources. And one thing is the quality of the input data. So you can have a very expensive camera with very high quality data, and that makes it relatively easier either to get a high performance or to build the AI and train it in general in the first place, especially if your training data is also of very high quality. But that may require very expensive trained personnel that we may have in academic centers, but not so much in a very qualified health center where there's no time and no money and the salaries are very low, and they do not have the time and money to support someone taking high quality images. Or the imager itself, it may be a very expensive camera that takes very precise images. And again, that is a decision that's made at the outset because that affects what your training data will look like. And if the training data is more noisy, you will have more challenges getting high performance. So when you inadvertently try to build an AI based on these very high quality images, it may not actually translate so well into the real world. And we have examples of actually where people are implementing their AIs and it works really well in an environment that's really high performance. And then you get into people who are in a hurry and patients who are not used to it and nervous and they don't want to do what you want them to do, not because the patients are at fault, because they just are not experienced as maybe an academic center patient who has been through imaging for hundreds of times, too much in many cases, as we well know. And so there's so many ways you can introduce bias, mitigate it, be aware of it, even where you implement these systems at the end, and how do you get reimbursement, how do you pay for it, makes a huge impact on health equity. And therefore I did want to mention that because if you move from the lab, so to say, from the prototype to actual real world use, those are important things that are not always mentioned.
Yeah, that's a great point. Again, kind of echoing our earlier comments around generalizability of AI algorithms, but not so much, it's not just about the demographic diversity of the patients in the training data, but also, as you mentioned, like practice settings, the actual, imaging devices that are being used, and also the operators or the technicians who are acquiring those images. So those are all really great points to round out that discussion. I wanted to shift gears a little bit into the topic of patient-centered approaches, and what does it mean to have informed consent around AI and concerns around data privacy. I know that a couple of the questions in the Q&A have been about that, right? Like, are patients always informed that AI is being used in their care? Can they refuse to have AI involved in their care? And so forth. So, Dr. Abramoff, I know you've had experience with real-world implementation of the autonomous AI systems for diabetic retinopathy screening. What has been your experience through that process with regards to informed consent and preserving data privacy?
It's crucial that patients understand what they're doing. So we are here, there's a lot of AI out there. And a lot of AI is invisible to patients, but may affect their care and may actually damage their care, as we've seen in a recent science publication. But we're talking here about direct patient-facing AI. And there, so the way patients using our products are trained and the health systems are trained is that they always tell the patient they're going to get a diagnosis made by an AI. So they're very, very aware of it. And I think that should be the norm, just as the liability issue, where the creator of an AI should take liability for an autonomous AI if it makes an error and the performance thereof. Because how could a primary care physician in a very qualified health center even know what went wrong or how it went wrong? The whole point is that they want to essentially have this managed by the AI. So there's another point to be made, which is about data usage. So definitely there is always talk, and maybe some tech companies say clinical AI and patient-facing AI is a way to collect data. That's clearly not our intent. Intent to make a diagnosis, and the business model is centered around making a diagnosis, not collecting data for other uses that the patient may not be aware of. But I think that brings up an important point, which is ownership of data, which is absolutely not clear. So HIPAA, there's a law called HIPAA that you may have heard about as a patient. You sign away a lot of things when you go into a health system and they ask you to sign this HIPAA contract, but you may not even know that you do it. But if you ask a room full of various stakeholders in healthcare, and you ask them, well, who owns patient data? The physicians will stick up their hand and say, well, we own patient data. Electronic health record manufacturers will say, we own the data. Health systems will say, we own the data. Payers, meaning insurance companies, will say, we own the data. And so clearly, it is not well settled. And I like to give the affair of Henrietta Lacks, which is not the same because it was about tissue. So maybe you're aware in the 50s, there was a black woman, a patient who had lymphoma, Henrietta Lacks. There's actually a movie and a book about her. And her cells were taken to make the diagnosis. And those cells are still alive today. And they're still being used, even though she passed away many, many years ago. Many drugs have been developed. It's used in laboratories, and billions of dollars have been made based on her cell line. And ultimately, that was not clear, like the ownership of that data. And ultimately, her estate, meaning her family, got a big settlement against these various pharmaceutical companies because they said, rightfully so, well, it was our mother owned whatever, and we want part of that. And so I see the same thing starting to appear in AI and especially in data. We already saw there's AI that you may have heard about, generative AI for creating movies called Midjourney. And that uses and scrapes data from the internet by artists and builds the output thereon. And artists are now saying, hey, we never gave permission to use our data for producing these movies with Midjourney. So you can sort of see it starting to develop, that people realize, hey, what is going on here? And so I think we need to settle this ultimately, either through legislation or maybe just with, through the court of law and with jurisprudence. But definitely there's a tiny issue here where it's not entirely clear what is legal and what's not legal, and we need to get this right. And patients have a huge role to play in this.
Wonderful, thank you. Dr. Lee or Dr. Shu, go ahead. I see you're coming off mute. Do you want to add your perspectives on how we can enhance a patient-centered approach to AI implementation?
Sure, I'd be happy to. First of all, the research environment and the real-world environment are quite different. The research environment is very controlled, and so when we perform these studies on AI, we consent patients. We tell them this is the purpose of what we're doing, this is what we're trying to learn, and then they sign a HIPAA waiver, which gives us access to their healthcare data. But they're fully aware of all of this. Because we're not at the stage of real-world AI use just yet, I actually don't know what the requirements are for telling patients that AI might be involved in their care. Certainly, there's lots of technology that we use, and we don't describe all of it. I think it comes down to patient perception and public perception of AI, which is that it's seen as this very powerful technology, but in some ways it's scary. And it's scary to hand over that level of responsibility and decision-making to this autonomous entity that we may not fully understand. And I think that's where it's important for us to engage in conversations with patients and patient advocacy groups about what are your concerns about AI and how can we implement this in a way that people are comfortable. And I think what will help is if we take a more graded or stepwise fashion. Obviously, autonomous AI is fantastic because it takes care of what we need to do for us. But along the way, I think we have what's called supervised AI or AI that is meant to be assistive in what we do. And here it coexists with providers. And so at the end of the day, you always have a provider who should be reviewing what the AI is doing. And I think this might provide a better stepping stone for all of us as providers and as patients to know that there is this human aspect while we transition to a more harmonious coexistence with AI. But I think, again, we need to continue to have these discussions, and that patients who are the ones who will be most affected have the AI as part of their care in a way that they are happy with and that they feel comfortable with.
Thank you. And Dr. Lee, yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, I was going to say, I echo Dr. Shu's comment. In terms of, especially, so when we compare ophthalmology versus radiology, so radiology, the field of radiology has a lot of AI algorithms that are currently being used, but they are not going out, for autonomous diagnostic algorithms. They're really going for clinical decision support system. Meaning that they highlight the area that they, the algorithm thinks that it's wrong, or and then it's more like the model is saying look here, something seems to be a little abnormal, and then so that really helps the radiologist to look at that area better. But ultimately, whatever model tells you, it's you as a radiologist who's going to decide what is the overall diagnosis, or what is the the final interpretation. And so I do see a lot of role in that. And then also that one, it's really the support system, and it's not the let's say what we say, the AI making the diagnosis. So in terms of what Dr. Abramoff was talking about, the really going for the people who didn't have access. So that would not be helpful, right? But in terms of really in a high demand setting where we physicians might not be available to look very carefully at every single scan for making a more informed decision, I think that could be very helpful. In terms of my thought, in terms of patients' feedback, would be really important, because I think as we engage in this conversation, it's hard because when we go to see a doctor, let's say that I am in a retina clinic, yes, I do anticipate that my doctor is going to tell me whether I have diabetic retinopathy or not. But if I have unrelated issue, let's say that I have a tumor or I have a bad glaucoma, my retina doctor is going to tell me, oh, I think you need to go see a glaucoma doctor. You know, you need to go see Dr. Xu. But AI model might not be trained for that. AI model might just be might know how to diagnose that in retinopathy. So this kind of inherent expectation that we would, expect from a physician might not might not be able to be the same for AI algorithms. So this type of dialogue is really important. And then what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And one more comment. As we enrich in our data sets, we kind of discuss a lot of this importance of good data sets, big data sets, right? The role of being able to data share easily and then being able to leverage all the amazing data sets that have been collected throughout many years through longitudinal studies, like randomized clinical trials data sets, or even survey data like from CDC and Haynes data. So there are lots of Framingham Heart study, lots of longitudinal uh, studies that have been collected. And if we were able to kind of share data more easily, then that might actually lead to a lot of kind of collaborative opportunities to train better AI algorithms as well.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you all for your input and experience there. The next topic I thought we might be able to discuss is how AI is used in education, right? So there's patient education as well as physician or provider education. And so I thought maybe if our panelists could talk about how you see AI playing a role in either of those areas, whether that's patient education or provider or clinician education. And there's several audience questions too around, how do doctors know how to work with AI, and are there standards around how much training there needs to be to use this technology and so forth. So opening that up to the group, whoever would like to offer their input. Dr. Xu, please go ahead.
Sure. So there's a lot of potential use and application for AI in patient education. We're doing some studies where we generate educational resources using simple tools like ChatGPT. You can ask it a simple question like, what is glaucoma? And usually it'll provide a very nice response. And we compare these responses to responses that patients might have access to through the American Academy of Ophthalmology website, or just through a simple Google search, for example. And what we find is that patients, as well as clinician graders, tend to prefer the AI answers because they're very comprehensive and they're well written. I think that's one of the hallmarks, which is that typically it has better grammar and it just reads very nicely. And so I think there's great potential in this regard for generating educational content. There's always this concern for hallucinations, like making up things, right? But the truth is that we as humans, we sometimes think we know what we're writing down is fact, but it's not. And there isn't always somebody who's fact checking us. And so this is an inherent aspect of working with AI. And then we have to look to the future, right? Which is, how do people consume media now? Yes, people still read a lot, but people like watching videos. And so there are these video generation tools, such as what Dr. Abramoff mentioned. There's a tool called Sora that produces these beautiful cinematic quality videos. So in the future, we can hopefully marry these technologies in terms of generating the content that we still need to review and make sure is accurate, and then marrying it to some form of AI technology that makes it more digestible or more acceptable by patients. But I think this is very exciting in the future because patient education is key in the eye care and healthcare process. Patients need to understand what disease they have and what they need to do in order to maintain the best outcomes. And we need to involve patients in this process. And patient education, I think, is often overlooked because it's very time consuming, right? To have your patient in the office and educate them. But hopefully in the future, we can develop these kinds of tools so that our patients are all well educated about their health.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Shu. Dr. Abramoff, please.
That's such an interesting question. And there's two aspects, right? Patient education and physician education. And they're actually maybe opposite of what some might expect. In terms of patient education, nothing is more important in diabetes management, as the example, than patient understanding what the disease is about and how they're doing in terms of metabolic control and just in general their health. And we had many patient panels look at the output of the AI, which is again typically shared with the patient when they come to clinic for the diabetes management. There's no eye care provider there. There's no ophthalmologist, no optometrist, no retina specialist, but there is this AI that outputs their diagnosis, or at least the how bad their disease is, but also the images. And it is really helpful for patients to know that they have diabetic retinopathy of some form and they're at risk now for going blind and they need to do something about it together with their provider. And so there's absolutely a role for the AI output in patient education about their disease, and it really helps with metabolic control. There's studies from telemedicine that have shown it, not for AI, to be honest, but we're working on those. And the other part is really interesting, which is physician education or training. When is for assistive AIs, I use them myself in my clinic. I want sophisticated output of very precise levels of disease, explanation of why the decisions were made, for glaucoma, exactly what was wrong with the visual field, where the arcuate defect is. These are all technical terms, but the point is I want very precise information because I'm supposed to be a specialist who can interpret that. What was interesting is that the AI algorithms we use that are in these products that are actually being used in the field, in the real world, is they're sophisticated. They have many levels of disease and many biomarkers for the disease. But it was interesting that when we decided together with the FDA what the output would look like, what it would actually do, and that of course has consequences for how you prove it's actually doing that correctly, we decided it should be as simple as possible. You're a overworked primary care provider taking care of patients with diabetes with an overloaded waiting room. And what you don't want to do is you see the AI output and it's this complex thing of EDTRS 35 plus center-involved macular edema terms you may not be familiar with, let them know what to do about this patient. And the whole point is you don't have the expertise and time to deal with all of that. You just want to know, is this patient okay? Or do they need to actually see an eye care provider because they have a high risk of going blind very soon? And so we decided on that. It's a yes, no. It, by the way, makes the statistics much more attractive in terms of the size of the clinical trial because you have only a yes, no answer. There's disease or there's no disease. And it then explains why it says that. And so it's actually interesting that the education for the physician, yes, they need to know that they're using AI. They need to be trained that they explain it to the patient and what to do with it. But it's minimal in terms of what the output of the AI is. That is not a very technical whiz-bang thing. And I agree with FDA there. It should be as simple as can be.
Yeah, that's a great point.
But again, that's autonomous AI, not where the specialty assistive AI, right? These are very.
Yeah, that's a great distinction about autonomous versus maybe like a clinical decision support type of AI model. Dr. Lee, please go ahead.
So I was going to say that there is a lot of training needed. So a lot of training is happening. So American Academy of Ophthalmology, so we, as ophthalmologists, we get trained with like major basic principles, lots of books, and then I know Dr. Abramoff has been part of the chapter on AI. So that is the very beginning. But there are a lot of training opportunities throughout major conferences, but there is a lot more room for improvement. I know Dr. Baxter, our moderator, has been the leader in terms of training the next generation of data scientists and really leading these efforts, especially in the Bridge to AI program as well. And I think there's a very strong need for this cross-disciplinary training. So we really need physicians that can speak to data scientists or AI specialists, and then vice versa. So there's a lot of growth that's happening among the AI researchers, but then we need them to be able to communicate with our clinicians to make sure that what they're doing is actually helpful clinically. And also our clinicians being able to interpret the results of publications, research data, and understand what are the potential biases, what are the limitations. Does this mean that I can apply this today in my clinic when I'm seeing Mr. So and so in my clinic? So there is a lot of training that needs to be done, cross-disciplinary, but then also throughout the different phases of our career, I think.
Yeah, those are all great points. And I'll just add briefly, I think there are sort of different tiers of training initiatives that people are taking on. And some of the training programs we're developing are for some of those folks, like the physicians who are physician scientists and want to really engage in research and AI algorithm development. And that's a different level of training than this more general training for your practicing clinicians. And there's a lot of active discussion right now with the Association of American Medical Colleges, ACGME, which is the accreditation body for residency training programs, about what type of curricular framework is needed and what kind of minimum competency there needs to be around AI for practicing clinicians who are not necessarily the researchers who are going to be developing AI models, but the people who are going to be using them. And it actually is, I think, a much wider group than just physicians, right? So one of the studies that I had been involved in during my fellowship, which was focused on informatics, was around this kind of socio-technical factors around AI model adoption. And we had an AI model for predicting which hospitals were at highest risk for readmission that was used by our social workers and case managers. And a new AI model had been introduced with better performance than the prior AI model. And I think there are several audience questions about, how do you monitor AI model performance? And in this case, we had actually a new model that was better than the prior one. And we found that our case managers and social workers were not using the new model. One question was why? So we conducted a number of focus groups and interviews, and it turned out that they had invested all this time and effort in training around the old model. And to Dr. Abramoff's prior point around the output, a lot of that training was focused on the exact cutoff number, above this threshold of 79, this is high risk for readmission, and our subsequent steps will be X, Y, and Z in terms of our workflows and reaching out to patients and trying to prevent those hospital readmissions. And so when a new model came along, they said, well, we just spent all this time training around the 79 cutoff, and now this is like a totally different cutoff, and we don't have time to retrain everybody on this. And so that was a very interesting insight for us, and thinking about, maybe our training shouldn't be around specific cutoffs, specific numbers, trying to make it a little bit easier in terms of the interpretation. Even things like, Dr. Abramoff mentioned a simple yes or no, although there's some cases where a binary classification or just two options may not be enough. And in this case, we talked about maybe a red, yellow, green, color indicators, and having different kinds of ways to simplify the output and simplify that training, because we are going to have a huge group of different users of AI models. And I think that education piece is going to be increasingly important over time. So, we've talked a little bit about the physician education and patient education, and just moving outside of education and still thinking about the patient perspective. I'd love to hear from the panel about the role of AI for individuals with vision loss. So when we're thinking about people who are living day to day with visual impairment, how have you seen examples of AI technologies that might support, daily life for this population, and where you see things headed in the future? Dr. Xu, I see. Yeah, go ahead. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, so I think there's tremendous potential for AI in this space as well, in terms of designing and developing assistive tools for patients who have vision loss. We almost all carry smartphones with very powerful cameras now. Some of them have LiDAR technology, which is just a more fancy way of assessing our surrounding environments. And by coupling that with AI, we can actually generate information about the world around us that patients with low vision may not be able to clearly see themselves. Hopefully in the future, you'll be able to ask a simple thing like, where is this, right? And the device that you're holding can help you in that direction. Actually, I have a family member, my brother-in-law works in this domain where he works at an engineering school, and he developed a program where you can have two locations on a map, in close proximity, and through the vibration of the phone, it can guide you through hallways and whatnot once that space has been mapped out in order to lead you from location A to B, for example. And so this is all done through AI. If you have an electric vehicle, for example, they often have these cameras that are collecting information about the world around them with the hopes that AI will be able to help guide the car in the future, or drive the car in the future. And hopefully we can use similar approaches in order to form tools that will help patients with vision loss navigate the world around them.
Thank you. Dr. Lee or Dr. Abramoff, do you want to add anything to that around technologies? Yeah, Dr. Lee, please go ahead.
Not for the individuals with the vision loss, but I think they're having a lot of programs or companies that have used like the VR system so that the caretakers or family members who have who have family members with vision loss, so that they could understand what they are going through. And it has been very helpful to really know what the patients with vision loss are going through, and then in terms of what would be helpful in terms of trying to help them with navigate, or things that they might not realize what they're going through every day. So I think that has been very tremendous in terms of creating better support system for those patients as well.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, Dr. Abramoff, do you want to add to our discussion on assistive
very little add. I mean, there's a lot of work on AR and recognizing scenes and explaining them in words where people have very impaired vision. And there's a lot of work happening there in addition to all the implants, Neuralink stuff. So yeah, there's a lot of exciting work there.
All right, and I guess more broadly, I'd love to have our panelists share, not just in assistive technologies like we were talking about just now, but where do you really see kind of the most exciting future innovations in AI and eye care? I know we've touched on a lot of different topics today around screening, autonomous AI, AI for clinical decision support. We briefly talked about generative AI and using tools like ChatGPT. But maybe I can ask each of you to talk about, based on your current work and your experience, what are you most excited about in terms of, future innovations and things that are coming through the pipeline? Dr. Lee, do you want to start us off?
Thank you. I think one of the Q&A asked, do you think the AI will be able to see things that humans can't see? And I really do believe that. And then there's a lot of evidence. So in terms of just looking at the retina imaging, we call it latent variable, latent information, which means kind of like a hidden information that humans just can't see. But if you train AI model, just based on the like a structural information, we could detect this all the vessel vasculature and then kind of recreate all the vessels, which is amazing. And we know that, from a paper that came out a couple of years ago, they show that if you train AI model, just looking at the fundus photo, just a picture of the back of your eye, the model could predict whether you're a man or woman, what was your hemoglobin A1C, what was actually your age, what was your systolic and diastolic blood pressure. I'm a retina specialist. I do this all the time, and there's no way I can predict based on the retina fundus photo. I could say, oh, this person's systolic blood pressure might have been 145. Uh, so it's amazing to think that there are so many hidden information just from the retina photo, and then even more exciting of more sophisticated retinal imaging, which we have, everywhere now. So I do think that that's the most exciting part. But I do think that the next phase is really the involvement with the patients, kind of really patient advocacy group. And then I would love to see this field kind of having more interaction with the stakeholders, meaning the patients, patient advocacy group, policymakers, and then just the general public to kind of really understand the sometimes confusion, miscommunications, so that we could actually make this research and then kind of patient care implementation more efficient, and then really advance it as quickly as possible.
Wonderful, thank you. Dr. Abramoff, would you mind sharing? Looks like he's frozen on my end, actually. Oh, okay. I think we can hear you now. Your video is frozen, but I apologize. Can you share with us what you find most exciting about future innovations?
I may not have immediate coverage, so thank you for that. And again, if something gets disconnected, it was so exciting to be here. Sorry I couldn't make it to the full end. I think the future is very bright. I think key is getting people the care they need and deserve, all of them. And so what I hope to see is that high quality of care, which is better than many specialists, becomes available to everyone. And I think AI has a big role to play, especially autonomous AI, as argued many times before, irrespective of what I do in clinic. And so I think we will see more of that for the most obvious diseases. It is all about evidence. I mean, we need to get the ethics right, but if we don't have the evidence, for example, for glaucoma screening, that it is actually worthwhile and what level we need to decide for AMD, for many other diseases, inside the eye, outside of the eye, including systemic diseases like Alzheimer's, neurological disease, but diabetes, cardiovascular disease. I think Niket is right, but the sooner we can start generating real evidence from trials, the easier it is for this reimbursement, which is ultimately the key. Without which, it will not get to patients. It will not be sustainable. There have been now successful AI companies that had FDA approval, that have randomized controlled trials that proved what they did was effective, and they're being bankrupt because they couldn't get reimbursement. And so, but that depends on evidence and getting this right. So again, the future is very bright. We need to do the right thing.
Wonderful, thank you. And I know you are about to catch a flight at some point here, so if you have to drop off, we just want to thank you very much for joining us today. Dr. Xu, you can have the last word on innovation here.
Sure. Yeah, so this centers around implementation as well. Certainly, it's very exciting that we can improve patient outcomes, the overall quality of care, but it would be great to also just improve the patient and provider clinical experience. I'm sure the patients in the audience, you have the experience of going to your doctor's office and you wait a long time. You get very little time with your doctor. Your doctor is often on the computer typing away while you're asking questions. That's just not the best experience, right? And I think if we can design more intelligent tools based on AI to help with this, certainly patient education, we talked about some of the implications for patient education. Wouldn't it be nice if you could have a personalized AI physician to walk you through some of the questions that you might have that your physician may not have time to answer, just because, not because they don't care about you and that they wouldn't love to talk to you, but just because there are 20 other people waiting to see that same provider. And certainly from a provider perspective, I would love to have more time to speak to my own patients, to connect with them. So there are technologies such as scribing technologies and other technologies to help with all of this data that we have to enter into the computer. so that we can spend more time engaging face-to-face with our patients. And then certainly even outside of the office, when you need your refills, when you have simple requests, just imagine we are inundated with tens, if not hundreds of these requests over the course of a week. It's like having another email account. And Dr. Baxter has done some really interesting work in this regard in terms of how do we deal with this volume of care that is needed, not just in the office, but all the time. And so I hope that AI can help us in this regard, and through research done by many groups, including Dr. Baxter's, hopefully we can streamline the patient care process so it's more enjoyable for everyone.
Thanks so much. And yeah, I think that's one thing that a lot of people are excited about, this idea of keyboard liberation, right? So we're not tethered to our computers all the time, and kind of restore these physician-patient relationships like it was in the past prior to all this documentation burden.
Yeah.
As our final question, as we're wrapping up here, I know we have just 8 minutes left in the main session. I was wondering if Dr. Lee and Dr. Xu, you could talk about how can patients get involved? Like, how can patients or patient advocacy groups get involved in AI and eye care? And certainly the discussion today, you brought up so many important issues and considerations and things where we're going to need a lot of different stakeholder perspectives, including those of patients and patient advocacy groups. So maybe Dr. Lee, can you talk about how you see that involvement, or where you think these groups could become involved?
Yeah, thank you. So I think really having this set of town hall meetings, or this type of meetings that we could actually openly discuss, so that clinicians, policymakers, researchers can actually understand the concerns, and then also actually what they are not concerned about, because and then also bioethicists, because I think sometimes we enter this conversation about what would be safe or what would be good for patients, and then often there's actually patients that are not present, and then we're trying to kind of decide, and then that would be actually really critical for understanding what research can happen and then really shouldn't go. For example, one of the topics that we have been inherently very interested in and then very invested in is trying to find out, is retinal imaging or retinal fundus photo a biomarker? I'm sorry, biometric. We also, as we started this conversation, we realized that there's a lot of misunderstanding and confusion around the retinal photo versus the iris photos, because the iris photos is what we obtain at the airport, with the clear, which has, with the iris photos, there's all this like personal, personal information, as opposed to retinal imagings are very different from iris photos. But then, that kind of confusion really creates, even more misunderstanding of what could happen, if we were to share all this retinal imaging data. So things like that, if we could actually engage in patient advocacy group or patient group in terms of, are you worried about that? Or actually, what are you worried about if doctors are using AI techniques? Or, is there any concern for AI, automated, autonomous algorithms, such as what Dr. Abramoff was doing? So I think those kind of information would be really critical in moving our field forward in terms of, and then because I think all we do is essentially to improve patient care, because we are all that's what really drives us. Whether you are in the very early side of biomarker discovery, in the late side of implementation, real world implementation, we all really want to improve ultimately patients' outcome.
Yes, absolutely. Dr. Xu, go ahead.
Yeah, so this is a really important topic. Certainly, it starts with patient interest, a willingness to contribute to the conversation. And I commend everybody who's in the audience today for spending the time to learn more about what we do. It also requires that researchers be invested in taking this type of patient-centered approach to the way that they develop and implement their algorithms. It requires us to open the door to have this type of conversation. For example, for Atlas, we have planned sit-downs with patients who go through the teleophthalmology program to have these types of lengthier discussions for this very specific use case. But again, we have patients who are very generous with their time, who we have established relationships with, and I think part of that is establishing the relationship. And I don't want to shortchange the importance also of funding sources. So oftentimes funding sources, they have priorities, right, in terms of how the work is done or what you're researching. And there are certain funding sources that encourage patient-centered approaches to clinical research. And I think this is really, really important because this reminds the researcher that this is important. And again, this is something I've been thinking about more recently, but also because it was a priority of certain funding opportunities. And so I think everybody needs to work together here to continue to remember that it's not just about developing the best performing algorithm, but producing a tool that improves the patient experience and outcomes in a way that can be adopted by providers and patients, right? And so it's just about having a conversation, and I think this is a great first step, the session that we're having today.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you both. And I saw Dr. Abramoff logged back in. Dr. Abramoff, if you're able to speak, we welcome you to have any closing remarks about involvement from patients or patient advocacy groups in AI and eye care.
Yeah, sorry about all of this. Thanks so much for that opportunity. Again, it starts with the patient and it ends with the patient, and so involvement is crucial. There's various ways. One is, patient organizations like Research to Prevent Blindness, and they actually interact with AI ethicists and with AI researchers and can steer where this could go in terms of what diseases are we talking about, what should be the ethical constraints for any of these eyes, what do patients want to see out of all of that. There's another very interesting platform which is.
Do we have any customers who require additional time down the jet bridge?
Okay.
Let's welcome you on board at this time. Again, any customers who...
Well, we may need to wrap up soon anyway, but if you want to finish that thought, and then I can do the closing remarks.
The other one is what is called the collaborative communities that FDA has created, where all of these groups, including payers, but especially clinicians, researchers, AI researchers, and regulators come together and desperately looking for patient input. So I feel happy to reach out to me. I'm happy to be the treasurer right now. So please reach out to me if you're interested in helping with this process. Sorry I have to sign off because it's getting early.
Thank you so much. Well, with that, we are going to be wrapping up today. Thank you so much to our panelists today and all of you in the audience for joining us.